My name is Nate Jacoby. I'm a senior here at Iowa State, and I'm also serve as a Service and Justice Peer Minister at St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church. I'd first like to recognize our co-sponsors this evening, St. Thomas Aquinas, and also the Religious Studies Program and Committee on Lectures. Our speaker tonight is a priest at the Congregation of Holy Cross and a faculty member of the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. During the fall of 1984, he co-founded the Andre House, a house of hospitality dedicated to serving the poor and homeless of downtown Phoenix, where he lived and worked until the fall of 1988. He then went on to Duke University and received a PhD in religion in 1996. He has also written extensively on Catholic history and politics. So without further ado, let us welcome Father Michael Baxter.
I'm very glad to be here. It's good to see old friends like Frank Cordero and others here in Iowa. I've only, as I said today, driven through Iowa, but I haven't stopped much except at a wonderful place up in near Dubuque, the Melleray Monastery, which I recommend to everyone. I hear they're low on numbers these days, but they take guests, and if you go there, after a while, you start liking it, and it's a pretty subversive place. They pray all day long. I'm also glad to see David Hunter, who I sat in a seminar with back in the fall of 1981. We're dating ourselves, or I'm dating ourselves, and again, I'm glad to be here. I was asked to speak tonight on, I guess, whatever I wanted to do, but knowing that this was going to be an election season, I thought I would share some thoughts that I have on the election. The title of my talk is The Politics of Holy Indifference on Being a Christian During the National Election Year of a Post-Christian Nation. It's election season, and needless to say, there's been a lot of stories that have been appearing in the newspapers on the election, including one that I'd like to share with you in the Boston Globe, which ran with this headline: Catholic vote prized but tough to define. The story was filed from Ettering, Ohio, and the lead paragraph of the story went as follows, and I quote: "From the asphalt playground of St. Albert the Great Church to the manicured gardens of St. Charles Borromeo's, this middle-class suburb, Ettering, has a booming population of the voters most in demand this election year: Catholics. People like Diane Fowler, a 33-year-old full-time mother who says she has one political concern, abortion, and so plans to vote for the Republican nominee, Governor George W. Bush of Texas. And Gerald E. Dahl, a 62-year-old landscaper who says Catholics should be concerned about the poor, so he's voting for the Democrat, Vice President Al Gore. But, the article says, the real targets of the presidential campaigns are people like Margaret A. Jerome, a 78-year-old retired Navy medic whose vote is up for grabs. She says, I don't care much for Gore because he's for the abortion business, and that's against our faith. But Bush is something else with his business with medical insurance. I don't trust either one of them," unquote. The article goes on to note that Catholics are the constituents of the moment. In the past, there were the angry white males and the soccer moms. Now it's the Catholics. And the reason is due to a coincidence of geography and politics. The Republicans have locked up the South and the Inland West. The Democrats control the West Coast and the Northeast. So this election is going to be decided by a handful of states in the Middle Atlantic and Midwest regions, states that are home to an above-average number of Catholics. Iowa's not one of them, I'm sorry to say. States like Ohio, for example, where Catholics constitute as much as 35% of the vote, as opposed to 27% nationwide. This is why Bush and Gore are traveling repeatedly to Ohio, the seventh largest number of electoral votes, and waging active campaigns in the counties that constitute critical swing territory. But these political parties have a problem. They don't know what Catholics want, so they can't craft a single message that will appeal to Catholics in large numbers. Why is this the case? Because Catholics don't know what they want. They're too amorphous of a group to constitute a genuine political constituency for several reasons. For one thing, plenty of Catholics are Catholics in name only. For another, plenty of Catholics who do go to Mass and participate in the life of the Church don't think religion should mix in any way with politics. And then there's a further problem. Even among those Catholics who are active, even among those Catholics who believe there is a link between religion and politics, it is not clear that the Church's social teaching is represented by either one of the major political parties, or any of the other political parties as well. Catholics are, in the words of political analysts, a cross-pressured group. That is to say, when it comes to the standard classifications of left and right, liberal and conservative, they are a group that is pulled in two different directions at once. Catholic teaching opposes abortion. It opposes capital punishment. It opposes euthanasia. It supports programs designed to assist the poor. It supports providing health care for everyone. It supports the rights of workers. It raises serious questions about globalization. As a result, to the extent that Catholics are well formed in the teaching of their church, they don't find a home in either party. It is this reality that sets the context for my remarks tonight, which are going to come in three parts. First of all, I'd like to place this entire phenomenon of Catholics voting and participating in the political process in historical context. Second, I want to explain our present dilemma this 2000-year election. And then third, I want to propose a political strategy of indifference to the election. Not the usual kind of indifference exhibited by citizens who end up staying home on election night and watching the tube, but a holy indifference, one in which a conscious refusal to participate in the election year rituals frees us to embody a genuinely Christian politics shaped by our true Lord and true King. First part, each national election year, and during off-year elections as well, the United States Catholic Conference disseminates a guide for voting to Catholic churches, schools, diocesan offices, social agencies, and folks in the pews around the country. One of the little pamphlets is over in the rack at the Student Center, and they're all over the place. These guides usually contain an explanation as to the moral issues that are before the nation, the principles of Catholic teaching which have bearing on those issues, suggestions for how to evaluate candidates running for election, and an encouragement for Catholics to vote. The stated purpose of these guidelines is to encourage Catholics to exercise their rights and duties as citizens of a democracy, to participate in the political process by voting and voting responsibly, that is, not only according to their own self-interest, but according to the common good of society as a whole. It is this understanding of politics that I want to bring under examination tonight and challenge. And I want to do so by placing it in historical context. And the context that I want to place it in has to do with the Church's embrace of democracy over the last 200 years. Writing with the big sweep of history, we could turn back to the French Revolution and the torturous history from 1789 until after World War II, when the Church in Europe slowly, fitfully came to accept liberal democracy as the primary political system that would protect the Church and provide for justice of all people. But I don't want to focus on the European part of that history. Rather, I'd like to focus on the American part of that history. Because in the United States of America, unlike Europe, there was in many ways no real difficulty in Catholics embracing democracy. As Catholics saw it, in the United States, the architects and practitioners of democracy did not see themselves as opposed to the Church, as was thought in Europe. Rather, they saw themselves as establishing a new secular order in which the state would vow not to interfere with the work of the Church, and the Church, on the other hand, would not be established by the state. The state, on matters of religion, would be neutral. And this was the view of Catholic members of the hierarchy throughout the 19th century. People like James Cardinal Gibbons or Archbishop John Ireland, not far from here up in St. Paul, and many Catholic intellectuals of the 19th century as well, like Erastus Bronson, who's buried in the crypt at Notre Dame in the downstairs church below the basilica. When you go to communion, I kind of say hello to him, because there he is, right in the aisle, buried. Catholicism is just so bizarre. I love it. And Isaac Hecker, these other great intellectuals of the 19th century. These Catholics believed that the United States had offered the Catholic Church a uniquely free political setting in all the world, one in which the state limits itself and thus allows the Church to carry out her mission. From this perspective, these American Catholics felt that the United States provided a pivotal role in the history of salvation, for which reason their position was dubbed Americanism. Now, this view of the unique role of America in salvation history was, interestingly enough, censured by Pope Leo XIII in 1899. But it nevertheless remained a prevalent view among Catholics throughout the 20th century. This was especially the case during and after World War I. During World War I, the hierarchy of the United States, the Catholic hierarchy, pledged its support of the war to President Wilson. And in order to back up that pledge, it formed the National Catholic War Council, an organization designed to mobilize the Catholic population in war work, what was called war work. There was to be a war council in every diocese. All but 2 of the 102 had a war council during the First World War. There was to be a war council in every parish. The war councils were there to support the troops. You had sisters darning the socks of the people that were sent overseas, and people praying in the parish and having mass. Care packages were sent overseas to the troops. There were visitor centers on stateside army bases, and then other visitor centers over across in Europe when people were sent over there. The military chaplaincy, as we know it today, was formed during World War I. In 1917, there were 24 military chaplains. Within a year and a half, there were more than 1,000. They wanted to preserve the record of all the fallen soldiers. They erected memorials, which was a very big thing after World War I, a comprehensive record of its work. Interestingly, war memorials come into play in a special way at the time of World War I because battle was so anonymous and mechanized and bureaucratized that they didn't know where people were dead. So they had war memorials. And that's really the time when those sprout up. All this is laid out in a book called American Catholics in the War. It was written in 1921, and it was written by a man who worked in the publicity office of the War Council, the National Catholic War Council, a man by the name of Michael Williams. After finishing this book, which really is drenched in nationalistic rhetoric, he went on to found in 1924 a little magazine that many of us are familiar with. It's called Commonweal. And if you read the early issues of Commonweal, you readily see this very Americanist perspective that America is really where it's all happening after World War I. And this, I would argue, is true more or less of Commonweal up to this present day. The War Council was founded in 1917. In 1919, it was reorganized for relief work after the war. In 1921, it was renamed the National Catholic Welfare Council. In 1922, it was renamed once again the National Catholic Welfare Conference for jurisdictional reasons. And in 1964, it was renamed one further time the National Conference of Catholic Bishops and the United States Catholic Conference. The United States Catholic Conference is the heir of an organization called the National Catholic War Council. The NCWC served as the institutional platform for the Church to set forth its social vision to the nation. This is during the 20s. A social vision that was rooted in a theological vision of Augustine, Aquinas, the scholastics, the neo-scholastic social vision of Leo XIII, and so on. Now, on the face of it, one would think that it would be a difficult task to get Americans to embrace the social vision of the Catholic Church. After all, this is the Protestant kingdom, and Catholics were foreigners. But Catholics themselves didn't think so. And the reason they didn't think so is because they maintained that the United States itself was formed on the basis of Catholic social principles. Indeed, it's not too much to say that according to Catholics throughout the 20th century, they saw the United States as a Catholic production. It all began, some of you will remember this if you went to Catholic schools in the 40s and the 50s. It all began with who? Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus was the great explorer and bearer of the gospel to the New World. And it continued with the Spanish and French missionaries, both of whom were Catholic. And then, more importantly, it continued further with the English colonizers, especially the Catholic colony of Maryland, where, according to Catholic scholars, religious freedom really got its start. It was a Catholic colony formed by an Englishman by the name of George Calvert and then his son Cecilius, and it was forged on the basis of religious freedom. And this religious freedom was codified in 1749 in the Act of Toleration of Maryland, principles which reappear a century later in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which in turn reappear in the Declaration of Independence, thanks to that good crypto-Catholic Thomas Jefferson. And the First Amendment of the Constitution. I mean, Catholic scholars really argued that Thomas Jefferson was influenced by Catholic principles. And the way they argued this, there was an article in 1916 which makes this argument, that if in his library was a book, and the book was George Filmer's Patriarcha, which was a defense of monarchical government. And in the first paragraph of that book is a long quotation from Robert Bellarmine, a Catholic scholastic. And in that paragraph, it defends popular sovereignty. Now, Filmer goes on to argue against popular sovereignty. But the language of that paragraph by Bellarmine somewhat resembles, the argument went, the language that Thomas Jefferson used in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And this book, not coincidentally perhaps, appeared in his library, hence the connection between Thomas Aquinas and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Now, any honest person knows, who's got a lot of books in their library, that there's no guarantee that the books on your shelf, you're going to read them. But, and so the argument didn't really hold up very long, but the narrative did. The narrative did. America as a Catholic production. For your information, in case you didn't know this, Catholic political theorists set up a line of reasoning that went from Aquinas to the Scholastics to Suarez, Bellarmine. It was handed on to the English Whigs, then Edmund Burke, and from there to the various U.S. founders, Madison, Jefferson, and so many others as well, all of whom were working under the sway of the Catholic intellectual vision. This is what I mean by saying that America, according to Catholics, was a Catholic production. This was an Americanist narrative that Catholic philosophers, political theorists, historians constructed in the decades after World War I, and then they reconstructed it in the decades after World War II, and I would argue they continue to reconstruct it to this day, as evidenced in the work of various people like George Weigel, Richard John Newhouse, Judge John Noonan, David Hollenbeck, Brian Hare, Dennis McCann, and so many others. At any rate, all this is in the realm of theory. But it's very important theory, very important ideology, because it provides an intellectual backing for the very practical issue as to why Catholics should participate in the political order. And the why is because they're true Americans, indeed, the truest of Americans, and because they have a social vision which can transform America. It was this kind of optimism that spurred the National Catholic Welfare Conference to urge Catholic participation in the political process throughout this past century. These were the years when Catholics themselves enjoyed a consensus on how to vote. Basically, you vote Democrat, because the Democratic Party was with the interests of the Catholics, working class people. This was clearly the case with regard to city politics, as is evident in the history of U.S. Catholicism throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. The Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and many others climbed the ladder up from abject poverty into the middle classes, then into the upper classes, and from there to political power. It was also evident as Catholics moved into state politics, and later as they moved into national politics, signaled most clearly in 1928 when a Catholic was able to make a bid for the presidency, Alfred E. Smith, but who was defeated. Many said he was defeated because he was a Catholic. But that wasn't to last for long, because a short 32 years later, JFK, Catholic, American, was not defeated. He won. And my grandmother, who spoke Lithuanian and couldn't read a word of English and spoke it broken, in her dining room was that photo that many of us have seen of John F. Kennedy sitting down in a chair, presidential, and the American flag in the background. What was that doing? What was that picture, that photo, doing in my Lithuanian Catholic grandmother's dining room? We've made it. We're in the mainstream. They used to put signs in the windows of Boston, Boston shops, INNA. Irish need not apply. No longer. The Irish are running a show. Catholicism has come of age in 1960, has decisively entered the mainstream, into the arena of national politics. 1960, Kennedy is elected. 1962, Vatican II is convened by John the 23rd. Reform, renewal, the church comes to accept the modern age. 1965, religious freedom is affirmed by the Vatican Council. These were very exciting days for Catholics in the United States, a whole generation of people. Maybe some of your folks, some of you, priests, pastors, social justice workers in the church, were all under this feeling that Catholicism was entering the mainstream, and they brought with them a confidence of transforming America. Mid-60s. But then, what happened since? 1960s. Vietnam. 1971, bishops say it's an unjust war. Large numbers of Catholic conscientious objectors. 1960s, mixed results as regards race relations. 1973, Roe versus Wade. 1980s, increased threat of nuclear weapons so that the bishops are moved to write a pastoral letter calling it deeply into question. Reagan was the reason that they wrote that letter, because finally there was someone in office who was crazy enough to use them, maybe. 1980s, U.S. involvement and support of the El Salvadoran government. 1980s, increased disparity between the rich and the poor in this country. 1990s, courts begin to affirm the right to die. 1990s, the Vatican publication questions whether just war theory applies to modern warfare in the wake of the Gulf War. In the 1990s, the Pope revises the teaching validating capital punishment, calling it into question. What we see in the years from 1965 on is a real tension between the Catholic moral vision and the United States, politics as it exists. What we also see during these years is that as they move up into the mainstream, Catholics themselves come to represent different sides of this tension. So that Catholic interests begin to divide along conventional political lines, left and right, liberal conservative, Republican Democrat. And this has been reflected in the voting records of Catholics. In 1968, Catholics provided important support to the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. In 1972, the same was true. In 1980, Catholics supported Ronald Reagan in large numbers. In 1984, the same was true. In 1992, Catholics supported Clinton by a larger margin than the general public. And in 1996, the same was true. So there's really no such thing as a Catholic vote in this country, which is why political organizers in the swing states are confused. They don't know what to think. But this indicates a confusion on the parts of Catholics themselves, a confusion that reflects, as I want to argue now, the extent to which Catholics themselves have accommodated themselves to the United States of America. The confusion that I speak about is reflected in a pamphlet recently issued by the NCCB USCC on the election year entitled Faithful Citizenship, which urges Catholics and others to vote, but which does not urge them to vote for anyone in particular, nor does it steer them away from any candidates. Rather, it sets out general principles, urges people to bring these principles on their voting. Of course, one reason that the church does this is because if it did anything more than that, it would lose its tax-exempt status. But this isn't the only reason that the church avoids this kind of instruction. Another reason is that it is not clear, based on the principles of Catholic social teaching, who one should vote for. There's a gap between the natural law principles and their practical application. And this gap can be negotiated in more than one way. Trade-offs have to be made. And they can be made in a variety of ways. For example, pro-life politicians are not very often attuned to the needs of the poor. Anti-death penalty candidates favor abortion rights and the so-called right to die. The church does not provide us any way of adjudicating these conflicts. Indeed, leaders in the church are themselves divided as to how to adjudicate these conflicts. There's the neoconservative Catholics associated with the journal First Things and groups such as the Priests for Life, who argue that the only vote of moral integrity in this election is a vote for Bush, because he will be nominating new Supreme Court justices, and the court could be turned toward limiting abortion rights and the rights to euthanasia. It's a serious argument, but not without its flaws, because you don't know how a Supreme Court justice is going to vote. There's other organizations, more liberal-leaning Catholics, organizations like Network, who refuse to name abortion as the number one issue and who urge people not to vote a single issue. This tends to be the approach also of many diocesan social justice offices around the country. There's a tension even in the United States Catholic Conference offices itself. I was just talking with someone who works there. The right to life people say that abortion, the right to life, should be the foundation of the church's teaching, and the other people who disagree with that say that that's only one issue among many, and they squabble all the time. So there's division among Catholics at the institutional level, which affects the highest offices of the United States Catholic Conference itself, and different offices within that bureaucratic structure. So these divisions between liberal and conservative, left or right, shape our church's political consciousness, and their standard within U.S. politics, and their presence among Catholic people and institutions reflects the extent to which the church has accommodated itself to the United States of America, so that its political culture mirrors the general political culture. Indeed, I'd want to put this more strongly. It reveals to the extent to which the church has subordinated itself to the nation's state. I say has accommodated itself, has subordinated itself. The church does this to itself, a self-subordination, self-censorship, self-limiting. And this is how it works in the modern liberal state. In the name of religious freedom, the church disavows all aspirations to political power, confines itself to a sphere of principles and values and norms which are at once removed from actual politics. In return, the state guarantees its security and its freedom to carry out its mission in the spiritual sphere, the religious sphere, but not in the political sphere. In this understanding, church and state are in symbiotic relation, mutual benefit to one another. This is the understanding that has shaped the narratives of Catholicism in the United States that I just recounted. The church works its way into the U.S. mainstream and is now poised to transform the nation with its values, its principles, its norms. But throughout this process, as Catholics set about to transform America, they also seem to have succeeded in transforming themselves into Americans. Americans who are trained to translate religious and moral stances into issues of political interests. The things that you have to tolerate in politics. Interests which are to be negotiated in a setting where there are other interests, other norms, other principles, none of which has any ultimate first status over the others. Hence the need to make trade-offs. Hell, there's only 3,600 people on death row, whereas there's 1.3 million abortions per year. How many times have you heard that in the last few weeks? So many of us are reduced to this kind of utilitarian calculus, the lesser of two evils. Or like the woman in the quote in Ohio, I don't trust either one of them. That's my favorite quote. A vote for Nader as a protest vote. Someone was saying to me, I was saying that, well, sometimes I think of voting for Nader, and the person said to me, hecklers, I feel so flattered. I think that's the first time that's happened. People. I said that I might entertain a vote for Nader, and someone said, "Yeah, a vote for Nader is a vote for Bush." To which I responded, "But a vote for Gore is a vote for Gore." I mean, or some people say we should write in votes. Write in your friends or write in the Pope, but he's not a citizen; he doesn't have a shot. Of course, in other elections, congressional, state, and local, the problems aren't as stark, but they're still there. Catholics working their way into the founding and growth of this nation, this narrative, this view that we have of our participation in America tends to conceal this difficult reality. It tends to conceal to us our own history and the way that we should, as the Pope has called us to, look upon our past penitentially. For example, when we talk about religious freedom, do we think of, for example, the Indian Wars that founded this nation? Do we think, for example, when we talk about American freedom, that this nation was founded as a slave nation, and that Catholics in the South were not bothered by slavery at all, and Catholics in the North were opposed to it just like any other American? What about the Civil War, or Catholic participation in the Spanish-American War, which was an anti-Catholic crusade, World War I, World War II, the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, a butchery of untold magnitude, in the words of Pope Paul VI, got nary a protest from Catholics, with very few exceptions, Dorothy Day being one of them, John Ford, Jesuit moralist, being another. But unlike the past, however, Catholics, I think now, have a sense that their social teaching cannot easily be embodied in law and public policy, which I think is a good thing, a hopeful sign. And yet we still have statements like this one, which come forth from the United States Catholic Conference. I quote, "We encourage all citizens, particularly Catholics, to embrace their citizenship not merely as a duty and privilege, but as an opportunity to participate in building the culture of life. Every voice matters in the public forum. Every vote counts. Every act of responsible citizenship is an exercise of significant individual power." I must admit, I'm deeply dubious about the political assumptions that underlie this statement, the ideology of voting. Invest the ballot box with a kind of immense power, a kind of sacramental power, the exercise of popular sovereignty. It's not entirely clear. Of course, the ballot box does have some power, but it's not. But precisely because it does, it also is the focus of immense concentration on the manipulation of voting behavior on the part of political elites. Manipulation which has become more evident than ever in this election season. Notice all the articles in the newspapers and TV news about strategy. Notice all the reports on electoral polls. Notice the kind of coverage of the debates. So much of which focuses on strategy. Bush said this because he didn't want to alienate them. Gore said this in order not to alienate them. They're not talking about substantive issues. They're talking about strategy having to do basically with the selling of the president, marketing. It's difficult to resist this marketing strategy because as the American people, we're so decisively shaped and addicted to television. And if we are shaped by TV, that means we are going to be shaped by the TV commercial. The reason we are watching to begin with is in order to watch the commercials, 15 and 30-second sound bites, which are going to discuss the issues which face us. Plus, of course, events that get reported on the TV evening news. The character of electoral politics this year was summed up best by one of our most popularly elected presidential figures. Back in 1966, I refer to Ronald Reagan, who said, and I quote, "Politics is just like show business," unquote. This creates a problem, according to Neil Postman, because Neil Postman argues in a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, that if politics were like sports, we'd be in good shape because the audience would be able to judge whether or not they'd be able to judge athletes according to standards of excellence. When you watch TV sports, even with all the commercials and everything, you know a good batter from a bad one, like those Yankees, good batters. And from Albany, New York originally. I'm sorry to say there might be some Cardinals fans in the area. You know a good tennis serve, you know a good jump shot when it comes to sports. But when it comes to show business, the point is not to be excellent, but to appear to be excellent. And the means to do so can be summed up in one word: advertising. Hence the premium placed in political discourse on the television commercial. The effect on our political consciousness has been disastrous, according to Neil Postman, and it's not clear that much can be done about it. Governmental censorship imposed by a czar or a dictator was oppressive, but you could identify it and resist it. You knew when it was being done to you. Now, however, with politics reduced to a form of amusement, people don't even know censorship when they suffer under it. One would think that folks would catch on after repeated exposure to those quadrennial pseudo-events called national conventions, a week-long political infomercial, according to Dan Rather. But alas, the political machinery is gearing up as if electoral politics this past July and August at the conventions consisted of genuine statecraft rather than stagecraft. All of this is geared to create impressions upon us, to get people like you and me to pull this lever instead of that one in the voting booth. Notice here how all this is governed by the ideology of choice. Choice as a private ballot. Choice in accord with my interests. Choice in regards to what I think is good for the country. Choice as the foundation for my set of beliefs. But choice in this case is that which underlies belief, so that one can choose God, the universe, society, the common good, not based on reality as it is, but rather based on what I choose. That's why candidates are advertised, so that you will choose them. That's why voters across this country are analyzed according to market strategies. And that's why it's increasingly difficult to stage interesting debate in this country, as I think we'll see once again tomorrow night. In the interest of, now it seems to me that, this difficulty with the election being bought and sold and us being treated as consumers is something that we need to identify. And along these lines, I'd like to mention one group that has really dedicated itself to trying to unmask the chicanery of the election season. It's a group called Billionaires for Bush or Gore. And it takes as its motto, quote, "because inequality is not growing fast enough," unquote. And it sets forth for itself the following strategies and policies. 1, vote for Bush or Gore. Although they differ on some policies and sometimes wear different colored power ties, both candidates are deeply committed to economic inequality. They bring their hard-won personal experience, making millions in a business subsidized by taxpayers, to national economic policy. Both oppose raising the minimum wage to match the cost of living. Both will continue taxpayer subsidies of CEO salaries, as well as taxing earnings on the stock market at a lower rate than income from actual work. Keep in mind here that Gore might be a Democrat, but he's still a plutocrat. Another strategy, free the Forbes 400. Another one, be bipartisan. This is their tactic. We buy off Republicans and Democrats. 66 corporations have already donated more than $50,000 to both Bush and Gore because when you buy both candidates, you can't lose. We're already in, no matter what happens, on Election Day. Another one, pay for America's free elections so the public doesn't have to. It costs more and more to run for office. In 1998, successful Senate candidates spent an average of $5.2 million compared to $2.8 million for losing candidates. Since people don't want public financing, because we'd have to pay $8 a year, somebody's got to step up to the plate and help. That's us, say billionaires for Bush and Gore. Big private money with few strings attached. Practice bribery, it will get you everything. And then finally, they say, remember, big money united will never be defeated. The group recommends staging a rally for the really rich, a tax loophole protection day, giving out silver spoon awards to local companies receiving corporate welfare, and my favorite, holding a million billionaire march. Amid all this crass marketing strategy, we need to be concerned about the way religion itself is being marketed. There's a lot on religion in this election. And the pace has picked up ever since Joe Lieberman was chosen as Al Gore's running mate. It was a brilliant tactical move for the Democrats because it enabled them to talk religion talk on the one hand and diversity talk on the other hand, two modes of talk which are usually pitted against each other. To the chagrin of the Republicans, with Joe Lieberman as VP candidate, it quickly became possible to appeal both to a version of that old-time religion, the kind that loves to express dismay over the sins of the president, and to add to that, the good old-fashioned American impulse to include those who haven't been included up till now, Orthodox Jews. The choice was heralded as parallel in importance to the choice of Kennedy as Democratic nominee in 1960. But if that's the case, it shouldn't augur very well for Orthodox Judaism. After all, it was Kennedy's great achievement to assure the nation that his Catholic beliefs and practices would have virtually nothing to do with his behavior in office. Not, looking back on it, a very salutary moment in the history of Catholicism in the United States. Lieberman has gone to great lengths to state that his religious convictions, unlike Kennedy's, would not be so well confined to some private sphere. But then again, the sphere is private enough to allow him to support legal protection for parents who wish to destroy their offspring even in the third trimester of pregnancy. This is the kind of religion that the Republicans are sure to highlight, along with the kind of cognitive dissonance generated when Orthodox Jews support abortion rights. But Republicans won't have much room to talk when it comes to religion either. Contrary to the explicit teachings of his favorite philosopher, George W. Bush has overseen executions at a more rapid rate than any other governor in the country, including executions of the mentally retarded and the sincerely repentant, such as Carla Faye Tucker, may she rest in peace. One cannot help but notice that both Democrats and Republicans, each in their own way, of course, espouse a disturbingly lethal form of religion. What is this religion, anyway, and where did it come from? It's civil religion, the religion of the American empire, not the religion of Jesus Christ. Indeed, if one embraces the entirety of the gospel, then one will not be able to fully endorse either of the two leading presidential candidates, nor the other two either, Reform Party's Pat Buchanan nor Ralph Nader's. And this is an important point for Christians to grasp. There is no such thing as a Christian candidate or Christian platform in this election, which is why we should take our lead from Margaret Jerome, the woman from Ohio who said, I don't trust either one of them, or any of the four, or any of the other either. But if this is the case, should we then be indifferent to the outcome of the election? I would argue ultimately, yes, but a holy indifference. Let me be clear about this. My stance is an anarchist stance, and I think it's a very good and a healthy sign that there are large numbers of self-professed anarchists who have been appearing at political conventions as well as at the World Trade meetings in recent months. Of course, the slogans, the confrontational language, the black garb, and enlivened by red bandanas is not likely to win much popular support. But what it does is serve to unmask the consensus-fabricating ideology that passes for objective reporting in the United States, in U.S. politics. Consider, for example, the piece by Walter Goodman that appeared in the Critic's Notebook column of the New York Times on August 3rd. Goodman contends that present-day anarchists can best be understood in the light of two 19th century Russian novelists, Dostoevsky and Turgenev, who, he says, rejected anarchism's ideological chaos and mistrusted its tendency to force politics into utopian abstractions of illusory freedom. Goodman says that these authors have history on their side. But when it comes to Dostoevsky, he says that Goodman's remarks are wide of the mark. Because while Dostoevsky spurned anarchism, it was not because it was ideologically chaotic, as he says, but rather Dostoevsky said he spurned anarchism because it was too logical, too neat, too ordered, too cut and dry, too statistically oriented. This leads too easily to the kind of social utilitarianism, according to Dostoevsky, that is capable of justifying heinous acts in the name of future well-being. The kind represented in the cold, calculating revolutionaries in Dostoevsky's novels, and also in the functionaries of the modern bureaucratic state, even democratically elected ones. Dostoevsky was no anarchist, true enough, but he was no statist either. As he saw it, the only hope for Russia was a rejection of all modern isms, especially atheism, and a genuine